Does one say Hallel on Yom Haatzmaut? This is a great question and has bothered scholars for generations. Since the establishment of the State of Israel, the question has been whether or not this is a holiday that rises to the requirement of saying Hallel. There's a requirement to say Hallel? Yes, it's a Gemara in Megillah on 14a. The Gemara wonders, how is it possible that one could be redeemed from terrible sorrows and not recite songs of praise? So the Gemara says, well, we don't say Hallel on Purim. And the Gemara says, well, we only say Hallel in the land of Israel. So the Gemara wonders and says, we weren't in the land of Israel on Pesach. The Gemara says, well, we're on the way there. But answer my question, the Gemara says. Do we say Hallel when we are redeemed? So the Gemara thinks for a second and says, oh, the Megillah is in place of Hallel. So I've seen some people who say that if you can't get to the Megillah reading, you should recite Hallel on Purim. I don't know if that's necessarily the accepted halakha, but I've seen it recommended. That's not necessarily the final conclusion of the Gemara either. One thing is for sure, this is a hotly debated topic amongst the later decisors in halakha, such as the Maharam al-Shaker, number 49. He says that it's entirely possible to establish new holidays when we are redeemed from terrible events, and we recite Hallel on those days. However, the Pri Chodesh, Rav De Silva, who was a contemporary of his, disagrees, and he says we don't have permission to go and enact new holidays after the closing of the Talmud, especially because the Talmud itself says that after the Second Temple was destroyed, those new holidays that were enacted were no longer applicable except for Purim and Hanukkah. However, later authorities like the Chassam Sofer and the Chai Yodam disagree completely. The Chassam Sofer in a couple places, Orach Chaim 191, Orach Chaim 208, and Yeridea 233, he basically debates whether or not there's an obligation. He feels there's a Torah obligation to have a holiday. And he says, in fact, we had a holiday when I grew up in Frankfurt am Main in Germany, even though he was a rabbi in Pressburg at the time. He says, I still follow that one, which is in accordance with the Maharam al-Shaker. And even though one of his questions was about having a new holiday on Lag BaOmer, he says, this is actually an obligation to have a holiday on these days. He doesn't specifically address the idea of Hallel, but he does say having a holiday is appropriate. But what we do know from the Gemara is that you would have to have a holiday. So it seems pretty clear that one would want to have a holiday, thankful for being redeemed from our enemies, and Yom Haatzmaut seems to meet many of those. However, this is just a thought and not the final halakha. Follow what your rabbi does in your community.